Unity of Houston is an inclusive church where we seek to understand and live the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters. At Unity, we welcome all people from all spiritual paths and every walk of life. We celebrate the diversity of our city and of our world, and we teach love, tolerance, and oneness, seeking to live in harmony with open minds and open hearts.
Wherever you are in your spiritual path, you are always welcome at Unity. Join us and discover that the life of your dreams is already within you. Thank you, Ken Gale. You know, we're doing prosperity first 3 weeks of 2022, and one of the ways I feel most abundant was with our music program here at Unity of Houston. I think I'm the envy of many ministers in our movement. So thank you, David, for all the ways that you prepare the ground for my message. As I mentioned, I want to thank Jean Marie for sharing unexpectedly week one, and she used my talk title and my description and gave it so beautifully, but you used my quote, my favorite. I feel really inspired, actually. But I'm going to use it again because I love it so much. It's actually a Myrtle Fillmore quote, and when I watched your talk, I was so pleased that you read it because I think it's such a beautiful, You know, prosperity can be taught from a very selfish and egoic place. I don't know if you know that, but it can be. I'm going to use spiritual principles to get what I want. But that's not what it's about. And our co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore, knew this so long ago, and this is what she said. True prosperity is not making money or putting good or developing property. It's determining what our individual soul requires in order to cause it to unfold more and more of God. And then how to harmonize its expression with the needs of our fellow man so that all are really benefited and inspired to unfold and express more of their inner spiritual resources. Oh, that's good. Well, I may read it again next week too. It's just so good. Prosperity is not about getting, it's about harmonizing with the flow of divine energy, living a life of freedom. Free from worry and scarcity, in finances, but free in all areas of our lives. Free to be who God has made us to be. There's a line from a Ricky Byers song that we are here to be perfect givers of love and perfect receivers of love. That is the essence of prosperity teaching. Here to fulfill that purpose of giving and receiving. I'm just very inspired, but what I want to do first is, I'm not going to do a joke this week. I know, it's very disappointing. But I'm going to do a quote from a great mind, from Groucho Marx. And Groucho says this: the two most important words in the world are honesty and sincerity. If you can fake these, you've got it made. I love that quote. And the reason I share it with you is because you can't fake your consciousness. It just doesn't work. The whole idea of working with spiritual laws is that they are exact. And they are always reflecting back into our experience, our thoughts, our beliefs, our patterns, our mental attitudes. And so the reason, people ask, why do you teach money at church? Well, one of the reasons is that you can't really argue with your bank account. You know, you can say you've got prosperity consciousness, but your checking account balance is what it is. And it is a reflection of your consciousness. Lock the doors. I see people trying to run for the doors right now. Keep them in here, because I'm telling you, this is a message of freedom, not blame, not self-criticism. This is a message of freedom. And believe me, I've been on the other side of that for many, many years. A struggling artist with alcoholism, you can only imagine. You know what my life looked like in terms of my checking account for those years in my 20s. It was a mess. And then I got to this teaching, and I was embarrassed. And I was like, I must not be a very good spiritual being then, because my money is a mess. And I kind of had to work through that feeling of shame around it. And then eventually I got to this place where I'm going to try it. I'm going to take the classes. I'm going to read the books. I'm going to start doing the practices and just see what happens. And I will tell you that it is life-changing, but not just in my financial life, but in all areas. It's about freedom. It's about stepping into that flow of divine reality. I guess I'm trying to give last week's talk anyway, because that's really what it was about it. So thank you, Jean Marie. It was really wonderful. Last week we talked about a prosperous new you. And Jean Marie did a great job about talking about the individual consciousness that creates our experience. And we're going to come back to that because that is the core of our teaching. But I chose for today's message an abundant world. And it's an interesting topic to explore when you're talking about prosperity, because prosperity and abundance is an inside job, and it's an individual journey. So what is our relationship to the world, to everybody else out there, and all that stuff? What is the relationship of that and my experience of my consciousness? So I'm going to look at it three ways today. The first way, I'm going to look at what is the human world. And I'm going to do a term that you used last week on race consciousness, race mind. I'm going to talk about that. It's the human understanding of the way it all works out there. The second way I'm going to talk about it is God's world, talking about what the world means in terms of spiritual reality. And thirdly, I want to go back to Myrtle and talk about a world of harmony. And that's really where we're headed, which will hopefully set us up for our final week next week, where I'm talking about getting in the flow. That's the space we want to live in, that flow state around prosperity. So this is what Charles Fillmore, Myrtle's husband and our other co-founder, in his book, The Revealing Word, this is how he describes race consciousness. And by the way, this is the human race. This has nothing to do with different races. That's usually the way we use the word nowadays when we're talking about racial equality and we do a lot of that work here in justice. This is talking about all humans, human race. He says this: the human race has formed laws of physical birth and death, laws of sickness and physical inability, laws making food the source of bodily existence, laws of mind that recognize no other source of existence except the physical. The sum total of these laws forms a race consciousness, separate and independent from creative mind. It's the nuts and bolts of the universe and what human people have experienced and believe about it. It's the collective consciousness of mundane earthly reality, and we share it with all the 7 billion people alive now and all the 99 billion that have gone before. It's in the Akashic memory. Have you heard that term? There is a collective consciousness about, and it's stuff like this. The early bird gets the worm. You've heard that one? Yeah. Good things come to those who wait. I'm stealing that from Mary Morrissey. Yeah, it's these ideas that exist, and and I want to say this too, in race consciousness, there is some wisdom. The wisdom about how to plant the beans in the spring to get your harvest in the summer. There is wisdom in that, how to start the fire, that we tap into the collective mind of all humanity, and it's available to us. But Charles was so right when he said, but it's separate and independent from creative mind. And this is the problem. That if we're just looking at the nuts and bolts of reality, if we're just looking at the conditions of our lives and go, well, that's all there is, that's all there's ever been, I guess this is just the way it's going to be. And you know what, I shared this before, and then I just shared it a couple of weeks ago, that when I get a bug or a cold or something, sometimes I go, well, I guess this is just my life now. I'm sick now. From now on, this is how it is. And that didn't actually happen with COVID, so that was interesting. But I can do that. I can just get into this feeling of like, well, if I look at everything in front of me, there's just not much hope here. Thank God for this teaching. Thank God for the deeper reality of creative mind. Before I get to that point, I think I had one more thing to say here. Yeah, there's a phrase, principle is not bound by precedent. I've done my darndest with St. Google to find the original speaker of this line. And the closest I get, the earliest printed version I can get is from Thomas Troward, who was a New Thought writer in the 1800s. And he said it's an axiom, which means just kind of common knowledge. And he was a judge and a lawyer. And so I believe that the phrase actually comes from the legal world, the English law, that principle is not bound by precedent. Do you know what that means? It means just because it's always been this way doesn't mean it's always going to be this way. And that's the problem when we live from race consciousness. There's no possibility of miracle. There's no possibility of your latter being greater than your former. And so that's where we want to move into, out of the human world and into God's world. And in God's world, I've got to read this. This is from Isaiah 43:19. Behold, I do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. That's God's world. That's the world of spiritual reality, that even in a place where there's never been water before, water will come. Even though you have no history of succeeding in this field, a possibility exists for you. And if we can tap into that creative mind, if we can begin to get a hold of spiritual principles and put them into practice, I'm so glad you talked about that there will be an action required for us to move into these teachings. We can't just think about it. We have to change our thinking and change our behavior. There's a line I learned in the 12 steps. Nothing changes, nothing changes. Sorry. It would be nice if you could just come to an 11 o'clock service at Unity of Houston and then it all got fixed. We would have this place full no matter what pandemic was going on. I would talk about that. It doesn't work that way. To tap into God's world, into creative mind, we have to remember who we truly are. You know, this prosperity teaching, I don't know have you ever experienced it in other churches? Because now it's in evangelical Christianity, it's kind of out there. Anybody ever seen it or heard it taught in Christian churches other than Unity? It's out there. I grew up with it in the evangelical world, the charismatic world that I grew up in. But did you know it actually started with us? That this teaching of applying spiritual principle to our finances and recreating that started in the New Thought movement. And in the evangelical world, it works because it's a teaching of faith, and you practice it, it will work. But because that's a dualistic tradition, for me, it kind of misses the philosophical underpinnings of why this stuff works. Why it works is because there's only one mind. That mind is God's mind. That mind is perfect, and that mind is my mind now. We don't believe in separation. We believe in, what's our name? Unity. We're a part of this mind of God. We're a part of this life of God. It is what we are. We just don't know it fully. And so when we can wake up, this is why we use the term a lot, awakening. This is why in the East they talk about enlightenment. It's bringing light to the darkness, remembering the truth that was here all along, we just didn't have it yet. And so we act out of our false beliefs, our error thinking, our false identities, and guess what? That law of cause and effect, the law of mind action, it just reflects back to us what we think, believe, and feel. And so we get the experience. The law is always working. And if we can tap into this deeper truth of who we are, this is Ernest Holmes. It's from his wonderful little book called This Thing Called You. The whole book is just like affirmation after affirmation. He says this: learn how to think abundantly. Think of the vastness of everything, the limitlessness of space, the numberless grains of sand on the seashore. How abundant, how lavish nature is. Learn to see abundance in everything, to multiply the good you already possess. Be consciously one with the law of abundance. Expectancy will speed your progress. Say, I believe the law of good will bring every good and perfect thing to me, and I bless everyone I contact. And now think of the thing you desire and say, I know that the law of good is operating upon my idea. I speak this word with implicit confidence, belief, and acceptance. I know that it shall not return unto me void. I know that I shall experience the good which I now affirm. Repeat after me. I know that I shall now experience the good which I now affirm. Now, what is it you want? Think about it. What do you want from your life, from this universe? What is the freedom that is asking, it's being asked for from your heart's, your deepest heart's desire? When we can get into that groove, plug into that energy, that flow, which we're going to talk about next week, our mind changes. That we begin to release that belief in the solidity of facts and figures, and we begin to open to the world of possibility and transformation. Well, what if? Principle is not bound by precedent. Just because you've never had money in the bank, what if now you could? Just because, I love this thing that Mary teaches in the class that we're about to start next week about when she and her husband Joe were about to sell a house. And they decided they needed a different house, they were going to do it, and then they went to dinner with a couple who were in this teaching, and the wife says, in this market? And she said, they went, oh, maybe this isn't the right time, I don't know. And then she said later, she and Joe were talking about it, and she's like, Joe, what are we doing? We're about to make agreement with struggle. How many times a day do we make agreement with struggle and limitation? That I'm here to remind you today that God says yes to the desires of your heart. Emily Cady says that desire in the heart is always God tapping at the door of your consciousness with infinite supply. God gives. And all we have to do to live the life abundant is to open our mind to that reality. This is from Daniel Ladinsky. I used to say that these were translations of Hafez, the Sufi poet from the 14th century, but one of our members who is Sufi said, not really. These are kind of new poems, but they're quite beautiful. This is one of my favorites. Tired of speaking sweetly. Love wants to reach out and manhandle us, break all of our teacup talk of God. If you had the courage and could give the beloved his choice, some nights he would just drag you around the room by your hair, ripping from your grip all those toys in the world that bring you no joy. Love sometimes gets tired of speaking sweetly and wants to rip to shreds all your erroneous notions of truth that make you fight within yourself, dear one, and with others, causing this world to weep on too many fine days. Yes, God wants to manhandle us, lock us in a tiny room with himself, and practice his drop kick. The beloved sometimes wants to do us a great favor. He wants to hold us upside down and shake all the nonsense out. But when we hear God is in such a playful, drunken mood, most everyone I know quickly packs their bags and hightails it out of town. Isn't that fun and playful? But truly, the universe wants you to have the life of your dreams. The universe wants you to live a life of not only freedom, but fulfillment, where you get to give your gifts into the world in a way that brings you soul fulfillment. You know, as Myrtle said, that we help other people. With our lives being whole and healed, we are helpful to humanity. And we get to shift that race consciousness just a little bit forward, evolve it just a little bit more. True prosperity, it means to harmonize. It harmonizes its expression with the needs of our fellow man so that all are benefited. I have been really blessed in my life to know some truly prosperous people. And I don't just mean people with a lot of wealth, although most of them have a lot of wealth. It's not that. It's a spiritual prosperity. It's the way they work with their wealth. And what I've seen, there are two things that I've noticed. It's with grace and generosity. There's no ego in it, because I've also known people that have a lot of money, but it's all about the ego. Have you seen that? And the acquisitive nature of the ego, more is always better. No, the people I know who really, and some of them are members of this church and some are not. Some have never been anywhere near a New Thought community. They've never heard of Ernest Holmes or Charles Fillmore, but they still live from these same principles in terms of wealth and abundance and prosperity. And what I've seen is just this graceful way of gratitude about the freedom that wealth gives them, and the generosity, the way that they help others with the gift. It's such an inspiring way to be. It's not puffed up. It's not trying to prove anything. It's, that thing, I don't remember, I think it was Mark Twain who said that most people work too hard to make the money to buy the things that they don't even want anyway, just to impress the people they don't even like, That's not prosperity. That's not spiritual abundance. But what I'm talking about is to live in sufficiency. And another word for sufficiency is just enough. How many of you, when you hear the word enough, think limitation? That's kind of what we've come to, but that's not what it means. Enough means enough. Sufficiency. That we have all that we need to live a life of freedom and power and wholeness. There's a story I'd like to share with you. This comes from the Jewish tradition. It's a legend and a teaching story. Many, many years ago, in a place far away, another galaxy, no, a place far away, there was a community. And they had a beautiful tradition. Once a year on a particular day, they gathered in the village, and then they walked together in a solemn and grateful procession into a particular forest. And there was a great, mighty, ancient tree there. And they gathered around the tree, and they spoke words that had been handed down for generations, and there were certain ritual movements that were done. And the intention of this ceremony, which was so beloved and so deep, was for peace and protection for the community. And this ceremony, everyone agreed, was sufficient to the task. As the world of form changes, things change, generations die, war comes, famine, pandemic, these things happen in the material world. And there were a lot of disruptions in this community, and they had lost the practice. But then when things settled down again and things were back to normal, a few of the older ones said, we used to do this thing where we would gather and we would go. And so they explained it to the new rabbi. And he said, this sounds perfect. So they gathered in the village, and they couldn't quite remember the words, but they knew where the forest was. So they went together in solemn and grateful procession into the forest. They didn't know which tree it was. And finally, after a moment of dissatisfaction and concern, the rabbi said, I don't know that it matters. Let's pick this tree. It's beautiful. Let's gather here. And no one remembered all the words or the movements, but the intention was the same. And the intention was for peace and prosperity for the community. And it was sufficient. Time continued on, more change, more disruption, more generations completed their time and left. And when things settled down again, the community gathered, and some of the ones who had been children at that last time said, we did a thing. I remember we went out in the forest and words were spoken. It was beautiful, and I think it really helped us. And they told the new rabbi, and he said, I've never heard of this thing, but let's gather the people, and we'll make this happen. And so he gathered the people in the village, and he said, no, which forest? And nobody knew. And so he said, let's go to that one. And they went out in the forest, and they didn't know anything about gathering around a giant tree, and they didn't know what the words were, but they just made something up. And the intention that they had gathered around was peace and prosperity for their community, and it was sufficient. The generations continued to pass. The disruption in the world and change, the practice was lost. But then some who had been children on that special day, they came to the new rabbi and they said, we used to do a thing. I don't remember what time of the year it was done. I think it was every year. I can't remember, but I remember it being so powerful and beautiful. And the rabbi said, wonderful, tell me about it. And he said, we don't know much about it. He said, let's gather the people and see what we can find. They gathered the people together, and they just made it up. Nobody knew about the tree or the words or the ancient rites, but the intention was to be together, holding peace and prosperity for the people, and it was sufficient. The way you're going to take up these spiritual principles in your own life will be different from anything that anyone has ever done. If you're trying to out Charles Fillmore, it will not work. God speaks in the language of your soul. And if your intention is clear, you will be guided to the right practices, the right community, the right ways of being. Because what I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that you are intended to live in sufficiency. Life is meant to be enough for you. Let's pray. And so we gather on this Sunday morning, here in this room and in rooms all across the continent. We come together in this ancient intention to know peace and prosperity for ourselves, for our families, for our land, for our nation, for our world. And in doing this, in moving into this intentionality, this way of living aligned with God's world, something comes alive in us, a sense of possibility and newness. Behold, God does a new thing in us. And so we release the former ways and the limitations. We release the old ideas and beliefs that kept us down for so long. And God speaks new life into us, and through us, and over us. And something in our heart and mind begins to break open, break apart. Possibility. New thoughts and ideas, new decisions and actions. And we do this with our arms around one another, encouraging one another, remembering truth when each other forgets. That when we stumble, someone is there saying, I know who you are. How good it is to be together in community with this deep and powerful intention for peace and for prosperity. And we breathe, we open, we surrender, we allow. God is here. All is well. We give thanks. Amen. Oh. I'm out of practice. If no one has told you today that they love you, I love you so much. Thank you. Thank you for watching this message today. I'd like to invite you to join us in person here on campus at Unity of Houston for Sunday morning or Wednesday evening services. If you can't be with us here on our campus, you can still join us live on Facebook or on our website, unityhouston.org, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Central.